We are back in the studio, going back to Google Hangout, actually, with Sean Nicholson, the executive director of Progress Missouri, also a blogger with the Huffington Post. And so just to get all of our cards on the table here, anyone who's followed your work, we know that you come from maybe the left side of the aisle, is a way to put it, but that's not the capacity we have you here tonight. We know you've followed this closely. So I guess before we jump into that, real quickly, Progress Missouri, remind us what Progress Missouri does.
So we're a communication and research shop. We work with progressive leaders and organizations around the state to get good things done.
So you also live in Jeff City. That gives you a little bit more time to be with our lawmakers. Tell us what you're seeing. Give us your impression of this session.
Too much time with the folks here in Jeff City sometimes. I think Jason and Scott were right that this is a somewhat anticlimactic end of the session. I think that for all of the big talk that we saw in January, not a lot got done in the end, especially when it comes to the things that Missourians care the most about. When it comes to job creation, nothing has happened on the Republican proposal to invest in infrastructure with the sales tax increase. As your previous panel talked about, there was no real action on Missouri Medicaid. So I think from our perspective, it's a pretty melancholy and disappointing end to this session.
So Ed brought up in the beginning of the show a tweet that showed the seersucker, and then that kind of touched on the topic that the seersucker suit might be sanctioned. I'm trying to get another S in there, sorry. Outlawed in our state legislature in terms of, there was a seersucker caucus. It was kind of a snowball that got rolling there and got bigger as more legislators were wearing the seersucker suit. I bring all of this up to say there are always what some from the outside looking in might think are silly bills going on in the state legislative session, but was this one any different? Was this one any sillier, or was there wasted time in this session?
Well, I think that this amendment from Senator McKenna, Ryan McKenna from Jefferson County, was a genuinely good-natured amendment, and it was jovial and intended and fun. I think there are a lot of silly proposals that were put forward with real malice of intent. Things like banning Agenda 21, a non-binding United Nations resolution from 1992. There was all sorts of floor time on that. They sent that to the governor. There was a bill that was sent to the governor to ban Sharia law. I think stuff like this is total nonsense and really is intended to rile up the fringe, and is pretty silly, and especially when there are real things that the legislature could be working on.
I feel like I have to say, though, there are obviously people who wouldn't consider that fringe, but I appreciate your perspective.
Sure.
Talk about something we haven't talked too much about tonight, right-to-work laws. That was something that here in downtown St. Louis, we saw rallies about right-to-work for and against, and didn't really see a lot of news out of this session. True? Untrue?
Well, I think the real news is that the bipartisan opposition to so-called right-to-work continues, and the reason that there wasn't any legislative activity was because leaders and workers and pastors and community leaders all got together to talk to their legislators, Republican and Democratic legislators, to tell them that this isn't the thing that Missourians want. There's clearly a national push by some groups. That's why we've seen things in Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Missouri was and still may be next on the wish list for some of the folks that are pushing these bills. But even yesterday, I don't think it was mentioned by Jason or Scott, there was something of a proxy vote on right to work. It was an amendment that targeted just the Kansas City Police Department, and that only got 85 votes in the House, a House that has overwhelming Republican majorities. There was still a very large bipartisan opposition to that means nothing's going to go through Governor Nixon, and that's not going to become law unless they send it to the ballot and spend a ton of money to make it happen.
Speaking of how coalitions form, can you talk a little bit about rural versus urban and how those two groups, do they come together or do they stay apart once they get to the city that you live in?
So there certainly is some tension. I think in Medicaid, for example, there are different forces at play for legislators who represent rural hospitals that are really going to feel the pinch from the changes in the formula for hospital payments. So I think there are more opportunities for Republican legislators who might be really conservative on a lot of other issues to come together with progressives, with moderates, together that will form a coalition to move Medicaid forward. I think on other issues, we saw even in the sales tax debate on whether or not to increase the sales tax, there was some conversations about St. Louis area. There might be more sales tax revenue that goes into the state. Does St. Louis get the same amount back? I think there's a lot of good reasons. There's a lot of reasons why that isn't that's not the best way to think about some of these issues, but certainly there are tensions between regions.
Something else that caused some tension that we haven't talked about tonight, Department of Revenue found itself in the center of this legislative session over some conceal and carry IDs that were scanned into the system and potentially turned over to the federal authorities in an inappropriate way, depending on what happened and who you believe. Talk about that. Can you get us up to speed on that, and where does that stand now? Is that tied up with a nice bow and done?
So I think the legislative piece, the actual policy changes, that I think there's some clarity on that. A bill was sent to the governor earlier this week saying the Department of Revenue can no longer scan and keep documents when they process driver's licenses. So the legislature did decide, I think with bipartisan support, to make some changes in that practices. I do think that there will continue to be a certain amount of political grandstanding in the summer and the fall around this issue. I think it's not a coincidence that two of the drivers of the controversy in the House and the Senate are both possibly running for the same office in the same primary in 2016. So I think that there's a certain perhaps friendly competition between Senator Kurt Schaefer from Columbia and Tim Jones from the St. Louis area.
Sean Nicholson from Progress from Missouri and also with the Huffington Post, we thank you for your time coming to us from